So today we find ourselves in a very different novelistic world than we've been in for the last week and a half, on the road. Did anyone take this course because they love on the road? Anybody? One sort of ambivalently, yes, okay. Sometimes I do get students who have just an image of this novel in their mind, or they read it when they were in high school and have a sort of irrational, passionate love for it. And so sometimes people approach it in that way. And I think in a way it holds that aura around itself in our culture and in the history of the novel in this period that we're studying together. I'm going to talk a little bit about its publishing history, its compositional history, actually at the end of my two lectures on the novel. So I would ask you just to reserve whatever curiosity you have about that. In a way, I'm flipping my usual practice. I would tell you a little bit about its publication history at the beginning. I'm going to do that at the end for this reason, that it has such a special place in the imagination of our culture. And so I'm going to talk about that after we have a better understanding of what's going on in the book. My point at the end of my lecture on Lolita on Monday was that Nabokov is trying to imagine an autonomous work of art that has a life to it, that is in some sense animated or personified, and that this desire to make the aesthetic something living introduces to the world of the aesthetic the problem of mortality. It's mortality that gives it that sense of ephemeral value, but it's also mortality that threatens to cancel it out altogether. The language that the Beats tried to imagine, tried to write, takes up some of these problems that we saw in Nabokov. Unlike Nabokov, these writers are not trying to make a language that is autonomous and separate from the world. So you will not see the kind of artifice and the labored attention to form. You're not going to have a writer spending a month on the representation of a barber from Casbeam. You're not going to get that in the Beats. Instead, you're getting a language that tries to come as close as possible, not necessarily to life in all its facets, but to life as we experience it. In a certain way, this is not a rejection of modernism and its desire for the autonomous work of art. Because partly, as I've shown, the desire for the autonomous work of art shades into the desire to replicate life. There is that desire much more explicitly in the writing of Jack Kerouac, the desire to replicate experience as you read, the feeling of having the experience that the writer wants you to have, and that the writer himself has had. That's always going to be important to understanding this work. So that's one aspect in which it shares something with modernism, even though stylistically and as a matter of craft and composition, it looks very distinct. The other way it shares an ambition of modernism is precisely in that effort to communicate experience, consciousness. So if you've read it all in the novels of Virginia Woolf, for example, or in James Joyce's novels, you know that part of modernist innovation, part of the stylistic difficulty, is the effort to put on the page what happens in the mind. That sense of the mind drifting from one idea to another that you get in Virginia Woolf's prose, so magically in Woolf's prose. So that is something these writers share with modernism. But there's one big difference, and I want to exemplify that for you just by reading to you two parallel texts, one from the modernist canon, and one from the beat canon. So first I want to read to you the footnote to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Now, The Wasteland was the first poem to have footnotes. And you have to ask yourself, what do you have to think the poem is in order to think that it needs footnotes? So I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but let me just read to you first from the notes on The Wasteland. Not only the title, but the plan and a good deal of the incidental symbolism of the poem were suggested by Miss Jessie L. Weston's book on the Grail legend, From Ritual to Romance, Cambridge. He has a little bibliography there. Indeed, so deeply am I indebted, Miss Weston's book will elucidate the difficulties of the poem much better than my notes can do, and I recommend it, apart from the great interest of the book itself, to any who think such elucidation of the poem worth the trouble. To another work of anthropology I am indebted in general, one which has influenced our generation profoundly. I mean The Golden Bough. I have used especially the 2 volumes Adonis, Attis, Osiris. Anyone who is acquainted with these works will immediately recognize in the poem certain references to vegetation ceremonies. And then there are particular notes for the different parts of the poem. That's the introduction to the footnotes. What I want you to note there is the sense that the matter of the poem comes from an archive of scholarly work, a body of knowledge that you read about. So now, and I also want you to note that language, Miss Jessie Weston. It's a very mannered, decorous language. Now, I would like to read to you from the footnote to Howl, Allen Ginsberg's famous poem, that for many people embodied at the time what it meant to be engaged in this new literary project. So this is footnote to Howl. Holy, 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 holy. The world is holy. The soul is holy. The skin is holy. The nose is holy. The tongue and cock and hand and asshole holy. Everything is holy. Everybody's holy. Everywhere is holy. Every day is in eternity. Every man's an angel. The bum's as holy as the seraphim. The madman is holy as you, my soul, are holy. The typewriter is holy, the poem is holy, the voice is holy, the hearers are holy, the ecstasy is holy. Holy Peter, holy Alan, holy Solomon, holy Lucian, holy Kerouac, holy Hunka, holy Burroughs, holy Cassidy, holy the unknown buggered and suffering beggars, holy the hideous human angels. A little different tone, don't you think? Few things I want to note about that, besides the obvious. The fount of poetic inspiration is not to be found in an archive. It is not to be found in Miss Jessie Weston's book on ritual and romance. It is not to be found with a bibliography saying Cambridge. That's not where you find the fount of the great poem. The footnote to Howl says that the source of Howl, that's what footnotes are, they're an indication of the source. It says that the source of the poetry is that wholly lived experience and a particular slice of lived experience. The formerly rejected, the indecorous, the ecstatic. I noticed that several of you were smiling in a way as I read that suggested you were embarrassed by the performance.